The question of the pupil. You have said that there is no such thing as a first conscious shock. And you have shown that in the food diagrams, the only place that a conscious shock could occur is to the octave coming from ordinary food and water. And that this is actually what Gurdjieff is referring to. This shock is actually what Gurdjieff is referring to in his own book, The Tales of Beelzebub, to his grandson, as being part Kadolg duty, or as he refers to it, also as conscious labours and intentional suffering. But you have pointed out that the first conscious shock referred to in Ouspensky's book In Search of the Miraculous is a conscious shock supposedly applied to the food of impressions. A completely different octave, a completely different food, a completely different thing. And to this food of impressions, this octave coming from the food of impressions, no conscious shock is required. This should proceed automatically, do, re, mi, as do the other foods. And that therefore the idea of a first conscious shock, as proposed in the book In Search of the Miraculous, a book by Ouspensky, is incorrect. However, when we examine this book, In Search of the Miraculous by Ouspensky, we find in this book a reference to two conscious shocks. Could you say something about this, something about why you think that there is no first conscious shock, when in fact Ouspensky writes about, quite clearly, a first conscious shock? Could you say something about this for us now? The teacher replies, first of all, let me point out that we are in a very privileged position, because in 1950 the book In Search of the Miraculous by Ouspensky was published. So we can read this book. Ouspensky's pupils could not read this book. It had not been published and was not published during Ouspensky's life. We're in a very privileged position because in 1950 Gurdjieff's book The Tales of Beelzebub to his grandson was published. So we can read this book and we know exactly what Gurdjieff was teaching because he's written it in this book. Gurdjieff's pupils could not read this book. It was not published during Gurdjieff's life. So we're in a very privileged position. First of all, we have Gurdjieff's own book telling us what he was teaching. And then we have Ouspensky's book telling us exactly what Gurdjieff said to Ouspensky after Ouspensky's death in 1947. A copy of the manuscript of this book, In Search of the Miraculous, was taken to Paris, and parts of it were read to Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff said, "This, very exact. He write what I say." And this book, In Search of the Miraculous, is very exact. Ouspensky writes exactly what Gurdjieff said. But the book also contains Ouspensky's interpretation of what Gurdjieff said. And this is not exact, because this is Ouspensky's interpretation. And we can tell the difference if we analyse the text of this book intricately. We can tell the difference between these two things. Where Gurdjieff is speaking, and Ouspensky records this very exactly, it is very exact. But where Ouspensky is expressing his opinion, his views, his interpretation of what Gurdjieff has said, this book is not exact. And so we can distinguish between exactly what Gurdjieff said and exactly what is Ouspensky's interpretation of that. And we can pay close attention to what Gurdjieff actually said. Now, with this in mind, you are asking me a question about the first conscious shock. And I have said there is not a first conscious shock. There's no such thing. This comes from the food diagrams where there is only one conscious shock required. And this conscious shock is to the food octave, the octave of food coming from ordinary food and water. Now, the first conscious shock that Ouspensky is supposed to have spoken about, supposed to have learned from Gurdjieff, is a shock to the food octave, the food of impressions, a completely different food octave, where no conscious shock, in the sense of a conscious shock required by the octave, is required. So, if we look at the text of the book In Search of the Miraculous, where does Gurdjieff say, or speak, recorded very exactly by Ouspensky, about a first conscious shock? So we look at page 188 in this book. Gurdjieff is speaking to Ouspensky about the first food diagram and changing the first food diagram into the second food diagram. That is, increasing the amount of energy that we produce as ordinary human beings. Ouspensky records this. There is, however, Gurdjieff speaking, a possibility of increasing the output, that is, of enabling the air octave and the impression octave to develop further. For this purpose, it is necessary to create, this is where it's very exact, a special kind of artificial shock, at the point where the beginning of the third octave is arrested. That is, the third octave is the food of impressions. This means that the artificial shock must be applied to the note Do 48. Now, when we look at the tales of Beelzebub to his grandson, Gurdjieff here speaks about this, or writes about this. He says that we have an excellently working automatism for perceiving all kinds of new impressions. So the reason the food of impressions, this octave coming from perception, the food of impressions, the reason that that octave sounds in us merely as Do 48 is because we have an excellently working automatism. Now, if we have an excellently working automatism, what can we do about it to change this situation so that this food octave of impressions passes from Do 48 to Re 24 to Mi 12? There are three things we can do. We have an excellently working automatism for perceiving, so we can disrupt, intentionally disrupt this automatism. The second, we can bypass intentionally and deliberately this automatism. And thirdly, we may even reach the stage where we can overcome this automatism. All of these things are going to require an artificial shock. An artificial shock, this is what Gurdjieff says. And he goes on to Ouspensky, back on page 188, he said, but what is meant by an artificial shock? It is connected with the moment of the reception of an impression. The note Do 48 designates the moment when an impression enters our consciousness. An artificial shock at this point means a certain kind of effort made at the moment of receiving an impression. That is, an effort as an artificial shock to disrupt our existing automatism for perceiving all kinds of new impressions, perhaps to bypass this excellently working automatism, or perhaps to overcome this excellently working automatism. This is not a conscious shock. Gurdjieff does not say anything here about a conscious shock. He speaks of an artificial shock, a certain kind of effort made at the moment of receiving an impression. So that's what Gurdjieff says. That's very exact. The next paragraph is Ouspensky's interpretation of this. And the reason I say this is because the next paragraph is not exact and concerns a different subject. Ouspensky goes on to his favourite topic, self-remembering, which has nothing to do with the subject at hand. And we can tell that it is Ouspensky's commentary and not something very exact from Gurdjieff, because if I give an example of one sentence from this, then this is it. This is Ouspensky claiming to quote Gurdjieff: if a man understands this, whatever it is, and tries to remember himself, every impression he receives while remembering himself will, so to speak, be doubled. Now, I'm not concerned about the content of that sentence because it's not relevant. This has nothing to do. The subject of the food diagrams and our energies has nothing whatsoever to do with self-remembering. What I'm concerned about with this sentence, and this is just one sentence, it's not a proper sentence. It's not exact. It has two subjects, and a sentence does not have two subjects. So this is Ouspensky commenting upon Gurdjieff, because Gurdjieff would not exactly state his case in a incomplete sentence, in a wrong sentence. Gurdjieff was very precise about the way he spoke. Now, what do I mean by this? This sentence, if a man understands this and tries to remember himself, so the sentence is about trying to remember yourself. Every impression he receives while remembering himself. So this is about when he is remembering himself. The same sentence. So he's saying, the sentence is speaking about when he tries to remember himself, and it's speaking about when he remembers himself. So it's about two different subjects. This is not a sentence, and this is not something Gurdjieff would have said. So you will think I'm nitpicking. You'll think I'm hair-splitting, but this is the way we analyse this text. Every word in it is significant in Search of the Miraculous, because it shows us what did Gurdjieff actually say, and what in this book is actually Ouspensky's interpretation of what Gurdjieff said, which is something completely different. So I discount this next paragraph because it's not on the subject, and it comes from Ouspensky. If we then go on, he says, me 48, in the first food diagram, and seen in the second food diagram, me 48, the food of impressions, passes to far 24, far 24 passes to sol 12. This is about the octave from the air and the atmosphere. Sol 12 passes to La 6. La 6 is the highest matter produced by the organism from air, that is, from the second kind of food. So we're slightly off the subject here, but the next sentence is the important one. This, however, is obtained only by making a conscious effort at the moment an impression is received. So this is something Gurdjieff actually said, very exact, and it links with what was said earlier. Gurdjieff says, for this purpose it is necessary to create a special kind of artificial shock. What is this artificial shock? It is obtained only by making a conscious effort at the moment an impression is received. This is perfectly in accord with what Gurdjieff writes in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. As I've said, we have an excellently working automatism for perceiving all kinds of new impressions. And we can only overcome this automatism by creating an artificial shock. And the artificial shock at the moment of the receipt of an impression is we must make a conscious effort of a specific kind. That is, we must disrupt this automatism. We can bypass this automatism, or we can overcome this automatism for perceiving all kinds of new impressions. So the actual, what Gurdjieff has said, we create a special kind of artificial shock by making a conscious effort at the moment an impression is received. Now, that's not a conscious shock to the octave. It's an artificial shock created by making a conscious effort of a particular kind. So there's nowhere in that passage, in the passages on page 188, about a conscious shock, a first conscious shock. And indeed, if we move on, see if I can find, this is on page 191. We have this word conscious shock. So Gurdjieff says to Ouspensky, working with one mechanical and one conscious shock, the factory now produces a much greater quantity of the fine substances. But let's look at this expression, conscious shock, that is what we're talking about. If you're going to talk about an actual conscious shock, then you either write conscious shock, or it may be appropriate to put it into quotation marks and write conscious shock in quotation marks. But neither of these is done in this book. Whether this is Ouspensky, whether this is the editors, for whatever reason. What is written here, it says one conscious shock. Only the shock is in quotations marks. So this is not saying, it's not right, although it says conscious shock, it is not about a conscious shock. It is about a conscious shock, in inverted commas, which is a shorthand way of explaining what has previously been explained. The term conscious shock, with only the shock in inverted commas, is referring back to the more complex statement that is made earlier, which is an artificial shock, which is obtained by making a conscious effort at the moment an impression is received. And this is not a conscious shock, which is why the term conscious is not in quotation marks, and the term shock is. It's a shorthand reference back to what is said earlier, which does not refer to a conscious shock. So I don't know whether that sounds complex to you, but what I'll say is we have this book since 1950. It's published, In Search of the Miraculous. We can analyse it very, very precisely, and we can find exactly what Gurdjieff said and exactly what Gurdjieff did not say. Exactly what is Ouspensky's interpretation of what Gurdjieff said, which is not what Gurdjieff said. It's an interpretation of what Gurdjieff said. And Ouspensky, unfortunately, puts this into quotation marks as if Gurdjieff did say this. So a very exact and very precise analysis of this book is necessary. And I say to you that Gurdjieff did not speak to Ouspensky about a first conscious shock. What he said is recorded very exactly in this book. He said he spoke about an artificial shock which is obtained by making a conscious effort at the moment of the receipt of impressions. This is completely different from the idea of a conscious shock, and in fact Ouspensky interprets this in terms of consciousness, in terms of self-remembering, But that's Ouspensky's interpretation. That's not what Gurdjieff said, and has nothing to do with any sort of process that we might undertake at the moment of the receipt of an impression. At the receipt of an impression, we create a special kind of artificial shock by making a conscious effort. And that's not a conscious shock, and is not referred to by Gurdjieff as a conscious shock. So that may answer your question.